Well, good afternoon. So good to see all of you here today. I'm Catherine Schneider from the Fitchburg Historical Society, and we think we have a great program for you this afternoon. It's about the little-known history of the Wisconsin P.O.W. camps. And the Fitchburg Historical Society deliberately chose this particular week to offer this program because of Veterans Day. And to present this program to honor all those who serve at risk in their country's military. And our presenter, Bob Block, is our neighbor actually from Oregon. Bob's work before retirement was with the Wisconsin Crime Lab in Madison, where he spent 34 years. He headed the Drug Identification Unit and testified over 500 times in courts as an expert witness. Bob is also an active member of the Oregon Area Historical Society. So if you would please offer a warm Fitchburg welcome to Bob.
Welcome. We're going to talk today about Wisconsin POW camps. And what I'd like to do is begin, first of all, by talking about U.S. POWs and U.S. POW camps. And I'm going to present 5 questions that I will address during the presentation. And those are, why did the POWs come to the United States? Where did they come from? How did they get here? Where did they go once they arrived? And what happened to them following the war? And then we'll transition into Wisconsin POW camps. Most people are not aware of the fact that Wisconsin actually had POW camps during World War II. And then they're very surprised to find out we actually had 39 of them, housing up to 20,000 POWs. In all my years of education, nobody ever talked about POW or POW camps. Now, what I'd like to do is start with this question, though. I often get asked, how did you get interested in POWs and POW camps? So let's start there. And my interest in POWs all began with this wooden crate. And you would say, well, now how can a wooden crate get you interested in POWs? And there's a whole story behind this crate. So let me tell you the story. I was out and I found this wood crate at a garage sale in Oregon, Wisconsin. It looked old. It was a little beat up, but it was in relatively good condition. And I have an interest in wooden crates. Now, as you look at this, you probably see a wooden crate. When I looked at this when I was at the garage sale, I said, you know, that would make a great coffee table. Now, you say, how's that possible? I like to do upcycling, where I'll take old things and I'll try to make something else out of them. So I may take an old dresser, give it a coat of paint and some new hardware, or I might take a couple of wooden shutters and make bookshelves out of them. So when I saw this, I thought it would make a great coffee table. And if you notice here at the bottom, I added a set of legs. And this now sits in my family room, and it is a coffee table for my use. Now, when I took this crate home, I noticed on one end a leather patch with 4 nails intact. And when I looked at it more closely, I noticed the embossed lettering on it that said packing list. And there was a bulge to this leather patch. So my curiosity said, well, is there really anything underneath that patch? So I had to look. And sure enough, under that patch was a small manila envelope that said packing list. Well, what was inside of that? And I had to look again. And there was a yellow sheet of paper, and it was in pristine condition. It wasn't dry, it wasn't crumbly, it wasn't smeared. It looked like somebody had put that piece of paper in there just the day before. When I looked at the paper and what was on that paper, this appears to be a list of materials that were used by military training officers for the purpose of training the military coming out of the war and going into civilian life. When I looked at this more closely, in the upper right-hand corner, I saw the date 1/24/46. If that date had anything to do with that crate, it said that crate was somewhere around 80 years old. I also noticed at the bottom, it said it came from Special Troops 4th Army Camp Swift. And again, when I looked at the top, I saw that it went to the United States Armed Forces Institute, Madison, Wisconsin. In fact, this institute was located at 102 North Hamilton Street, between the Capitol and the university campus. This institute will be there from about 1945 to 1974, the end of World War II to about the end of the Vietnam War. As I mentioned, again, the list of the materials appear to be that used by the trainers for those transitioning out of the military into civilian life. When I actually looked under that leather patch, I found a second manila envelope with multiple pages listing materials that had been in this wooden crate. And those appeared to be the pamphlets and booklets that they actually handed out to those transitioning to military life. Well, while I know a lot of information about this crate, I didn't know several questions that I still had an interest in. That is, where has this box been for the past 78 years? We know it came from Camp Swift in Texas. We know it went to the Army Institute in Madison. But where has it been since that time? How did it end up in a garage sale in Oregon, Wisconsin? Who had it and what did they do with it? And did anybody else take the time to look under that leather patch to see if there was anything there or not? And I find it hard to believe that nobody else was curious enough that they would have looked. I'm glad that I did. Now, while it's not unusual to find an artifact at a garage sale, an artifact is defined as anything that is made by man. So obviously this crate qualifies as an artifact. What is unusual is to find an artifact that actually has a recorded history of that artifact attached to it, as this one did, telling us that, again, it came from Camp Swift in Texas, that it went to the Army Institute in Madison, and when that occurred and what it contained. So truly, this wood crate is a historical artifact. Now, I've never told this to the individual that I bought this from at the garage sale. Perhaps if I had, he would have charged me a whole lot more than he did for that wooden crate. Now, while I learned a lot about the crate, I wanted to know something about Camp Swift. And this is what Camp Swift looked like back in 1941. Camp Swift was located outside of Bastrop, Texas, which is just outside of Austin, Texas. It was built in 1941 on 56,000 acres of land. It had 2,800 buildings, none of which exist today. It was built in only 120 days at a cost of $25 million, and it was commissioned in May of 1942. This camp will hold up to 90,000 GIs, making it the largest training and transshipment camps in Texas. And it will train over 300,000 GIs to go and fight the war. Camp Swift is still around today, but it's only about 1/5 of its original size. And today it is the National Arms Training Center and the Texas Guard Training Center. Here's where I got interested in POWs. During World War II, this camp held up to 10,000 German POWs. And I thought, well, if Camp Swift had POWs, what about Camp McCoy here in Wisconsin? So I had to look into that, and sure enough, Camp McCoy also had POWs during World War II. And that just led to further research and more information regarding POW and POW camps. Now, when we talk about war, we have to also talk about destruction, death, and POWs. If we take into consideration the destruction of homes, businesses, manufacturing, infrastructure in Britain, Europe, Russia, Japan, it will come to trillions and trillions of dollars. In a current research that I'm looking at, it was estimated in today's dollars, it would be somewhere in the area of $18 trillion. War will always bring death. World War II ran from September of 1939 to September of 1945, and we will never know the true number of deaths during that time. But it is estimated that there were 21 to 25 million military deaths, 50 to 55 million civilian deaths, and 5 to 6 million Holocaust deaths, for a total of 70 to 85 million people simply perished during World War II. And you notice if you look at the graph here that it's always civilians that will have the largest number, almost in a ratio of 2 to 1 versus military. And we will have lost 3% of the world's population at that time, which was around 2.3 billion people. And during this time, Germany will have 1,000 or more POW camps. Now, if you were a Russian, you did not want to be a German POW. There will be some 6 million Russian POWs. 3 million will not survive captivity. And they will die from starvation, exposure, illness, forced hard labor, and death marches. But likewise, if you're a German, you do not want to be a Russian POW. There will be some 3 million German POWs. 1 million will not survive captivity. And they will die from many of the same causes. If you are a German POW in Russia, you will be sentenced to 25 years of hard labor, and you will perform that hard labor during and after the war. Most of the German POWs are released in 1950. Remember, the war ends in 1945. The last of the German POWs will be released in 1956. If you're an American, you do not want to be a Japanese POW. There will be some 27,000 American POWs. 40%, or 10,800, will not survive captivity. And they again will die from many of the same causes. The Japanese have what they call their battlefield code of conduct. And this code says you will fight to the death. And not only do they hold that expectation for themselves, but they hold that expectation for you and your country, that you will fight to the death for your country. And if somehow you manage to survive, then you are not worth anything but hard labor. And if you cannot perform that hard labor, you are not worth anything at all, and you are eliminated. We will have death marches around the world, whether it's Japan, Germany, or Russia. But perhaps the most famous death march is that of the Bataan Death March in the Philippines. The Japanese will attack Pearl Harbor on December 7th of 1941. The next day, on December 8th of 1941, they will attack the Philippines. And they will either destroy or damage essentially all of the U.S. aircraft, so there can be no counterattack. But unlike Pearl Harbor, they will follow this air assault with a land assault and a blockade around the island. The Allied forces will fight with the Japanese, and the Japanese will force them to the southern tip of the Bataan Peninsula. After 3 months of furious and vicious fighting, the Americans have run out of supply and food and have reached a point of starvation, and they will surrender. And on April 9th of 1942, the Japanese will capture 75 Allied forces. They will then make them march 65 miles from the tip of the peninsula to a railroad head to the north. Once they reach that, they will be put on trains and boxcars and shipped to Camp O'Donnell, a concentration camp. Of the 75,000 that were captured and led on this death march, only 54,000 will reach Camp O'Donnell. The others will either die during that march or in transportation to Camp O'Donnell. As a little sidelight here, if you enjoy reading about World War II and you want to learn a little bit about some of the German POW POW camps and a death march, you might find this book very interesting called Tailspin. John Armbruster was a teacher in Gay Mills, Wisconsin, and he'd heard about this gentleman, Gene Moran, from Soldiers Grove, and he thought maybe the story that he had would be very interesting to record and write. Gene Moran was a 19-year-old tail gunner in a flying fortress. On a mission over Germany, his plane is shot down. He remains in the tail section and he falls 4.5 miles out of the sky, hitting a tree and crashing to the ground, and he survives. He's captured and he becomes a German POW for 18 months. Now at the end of the war, as the enemy is approaching, Germany must begin to move these POWs and prisoners, and they will do death marches. As their railroad structure is destroyed, they don't have trucks anymore to move them, and they will make them march. Gene Moran will survive a 600-mile death march. Very, very interesting story, and you might find it enjoyable to read. Now, this is an interesting statistic. We just got done talking about 6 million Russian POWs and 3 million German POWs. The U.S. has had a total of 142,227 American POWs combined from World War I, World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War. And while that seems like a relatively large number, it's quite small to the comparison of 3 and 6 million. And of these 142, 1,929 were Wisconsinites. And again, of that total, 15,190 die in captivity. The interesting number here is, of those 15,000, 3/4 of them died at the hands of the Japanese during World War II. As vicious as the German concentration camps were, the Japanese were even worse. I do another presentation called VJ Day, and in there you will learn more about some of the treatment by the Japanese on the POWs. Well, the U.S., Japan attacks Pearl Harbor on December 7th of 1941. The U.S. then the following day declares war against Japan on December 8th of 1941. It's kind of interesting that on December 11th of 1941, Germany declares war against the U.S., the only country it declares war against. And the U.S. then retaliates immediately and declares war on Germany. Up until this point, Britain has taken and held all POWs from the European front. They no longer have room to hold these POWs. And the U.S. now agrees that beginning in early 1942, we will take all POWs, regardless of where they come from, whether it's the European front, whether it's from Africa, or whether they are from Japan. And the way we would get these POWs, we'd send our ships out with our supplies and our military, and we'd bring back the injured and the POWs. When they came to the U.S., they would go to one of 511 area camps or 175 branch camps. Now, this is an early number because you're going to find out that there's going to be a whole lot more than what we have here if we were to add these up. The base camps would consist of existing conservation corps camps or military bases, so civilian conservation camps. And the reason we would use those and the military base is because they already had the infrastructure, the barracks, the plumbing, the water, and all that stuff. And they also would have guards. Initially, the thought was we would build our POW camps overseas near the war front, but that immediately presented problems. We would have to ship the building materials overseas in order to build these barracks. And then also the infrastructure, the plumbing, the electrical, and so forth. And that would be costly to do. But even more costly, we would have to leave military there to guard these POW camps. And we sorely needed them on the war front. And so the decision was made, we will bring the POWs to the U.S. We'd have to be concerned about mutiny and revolts, whether overseas or here. Perhaps the one thing that we would have to be most concerned about would be the fact if they were overseas, the enemy attacking these POW camps in an effort to release the POWs so they could go back and fight the war. By bringing them here, we eliminated that problem altogether. When they brought these POWs, most civilians were not even aware of the fact that we were having these POWs and these camps in our backyard. Stories about POWs and POW camps were censored. The government did not want intermingling between POWs and civilians for a number of different reasons. You know, one of those being loose lips sink ships. So we didn't want interaction and sharing of information between these POW and civilians. You're going to find out as we go through and I tell you some of the stories of some of these branch camps. The government did not do a real good job of preventing this intermingling between POWs and civilians. We'll have a total of 2,287 escapes from the POW camps nationwide. And most of those will be caught in a relatively short period, a day, maybe two. Some of them will go longer. Initially, I had thought that there were no POWs that ever escaped and got back to their home country. And then on some more recent research that I've done, I'm still editing this thing as we're going along here. I found out that recently that there were 12 fugitive POWs at the end of the war. And they will all eventually be caught. The last one escapes in 1945. He will then hide in plain sight and turn himself in 40 years later. He was referred to as Hitler's last soldier in the U.S. Now, I just want to tell you about one escape that happened in the U.S., and I call it the Great Arizona Escape. And this happened at Camp Papago Park in Phoenix. And this is where we would do our desert training before we sent our military off to Africa to fight the war. They had a batch of German naval POWs here. And I always thought it's kind of ironic that you have these men who spent their life on the ocean being sent to a desert POW camp. Kind of appropriate. They didn't have work at this camp for the POWs like we did here in Wisconsin. And the POWs wanted to have something to do, so they asked the camp commander if they could have tools to build a volleyball court. And the camp commander thought, well, that'll keep them busy and give them some activity, and they won't be bugging me. So he provides them the tools to build their volleyball court. And they put those tools to very good use. And on December 23rd of 1944, 25 of those POWs will escape through a 178-foot-long tunnel, going under 2 fences around the camp and a service road, and coming out on the side of a canal. 3 of those German POWs will actually build a collapsible canoe that they'll take with them, because their intention was to walk 30 miles to the Gila River, float their canoe down the river to the Colorado, and then float down the Colorado to the Gulf of Mexico. The only problem that they had was when they got to the Gila River, they forgot they were in a desert, and there was no water in the Gila River. So off into the desert they went. About 6 of them realized the harsh conditions they were going to be under, and they will simply turn themselves in. The other 19 will be caught in a relatively short time. On the left here is the entrance to that escape tunnel. It dropped down 6 feet and went 178 feet under the ground. On the right is the newspaper article appearing in the paper the next day, telling about this great escape. And you will notice that the reward here for capture is $25. We just had a month or so ago 7 prisoners escape in Louisiana, and the capture fee there was $20,000. Obviously, a fair amount of inflation has happened since that time. It's also interesting when I was doing this research, what the Germans said, the ones that escaped, that really the only reason they did this was it gave them something to do, and they just wanted to see if they could do it. Many of them really had no intentions of going anywhere once they had escaped. Well, we don't have POW camps in the U.S. anymore, and you would probably it would be hard for you to even know that these camps had once existed. On the right is a plaque that sits right over the top of where that escape tunnel entrance was at Camp Papago. Camp Papago still exists today, but it's nothing more than a few administrative buildings. Interestingly enough, I got this photo because one of the members on the Historical Society board, this is his son, when they took a trip to Phoenix. And they didn't even know it was here, and they didn't know anything about POW camps. They just happened to go by it by accident and find out about it. In Wisconsin, again, most of these camps were around for only a very short period of time, a couple of months or so. And you would have no way of knowing these camps ever existed. But on the left is a marker at Camp Reedsburg, and it tells a little bit about the camp in Reedsburg. I have a neighbor that lives just down the street from me. She grew up in Reedsburg, never knew they had a POW camp until she went to one of the presentations. Well, every state will have POW camps, except for Hawaii, Nevada, North Dakota, and Vermont. California will have the most with 110. Texas will be next with 80. Wisconsin will have 39. We have 38 branch camps and then the base camp, making a total of 39. If we look at a map as to where these camps are located throughout the United States, they tend to be concentrated to the south because they would be cheaper to put up a tent encampment versus a wooden barracks, and cheaper to heat those camps in the south than in the north. If we add to this the military medical facilities holding POWs, there will be over 1,000 locations in the U.S. holding POWs. We will have in excess of 425,000 POWs consisting primarily of German, Italian, and Japanese. But we will have other nationalities as well, Russian, African, Turkish, and so forth. We talked about the number of POWs that do not survive captivity in Germany and Russia. In the U.S., we only have 477 deaths, but those will be due to 265 natural causes, 72 suicides, 43 traffic accidents, 17 drownings, and 14 POWs will be found guilty of murder of another POW. They will be tried and they will be hung. Initially, I thought no POWs were killed in the U.S., but again, on some further research, I found that we actually had a total of 56 POWs killed in the U.S. in an attempt to escape. And they were killed primarily by military, and a few were killed by civilians with gun-happy triggers on their guns. But again, a relatively small number compared to those in Germany and Russia. The U.S. will treat its POWs very humanely following the Geneva Convention and the Red Cross Accords. All right, well, let's switch over to Wisconsin POW camps. The information I'm going to share with you comes from this book, Stalag, Wisconsin, by Betty Colley. Betty Colley was a history teacher in Altoona, Wisconsin, and her students would not believe her when she told them that Altoona once housed POWs. Upon retirement, she begins her research to write her book. Information is difficult to come by. Remember, many stories or any stories about POW and POW camps were censored. The records of these branch camps in the National Archives were destroyed in the 1950s. But in addition to her research, she will talk to 300 or more individuals that either were in a POW camp, worked with a POW, or lived in a community that had a POW camp. The first and largest POW camp in Wisconsin will be Camp McCoy. This will be a camp within Fort McCoy. Camp McCoy will be a 20-acre site surrounded by a double 8-foot chain link fence. It will have guard towers, guards, and guard dogs. There will be some 30 to 35 buildings on the grounds, including kitchen, mess hall, barracks, bathrooms, and showers. The POWs will do their own cooking. They will maintain their mess hall, the grounds, the barracks. They will do their own laundry. These camps are fairly self-sufficient. Here's a rendering or drawing of what Camp McCoy looked like in 1943 by a German POW. In my career, I would spend some time at Camp McCoy doing some training with law enforcement, and Camp McCoy doesn't look a whole lot different than it did back in the 1940s. The government will get the maximum use out of their buildings. Well, the first of the POWs will arrive at Camp McCoy in early 1942. And Camp McCoy is already there, and it already is operating, but it is serving as an internment camp for any Germans, Italians, or Japanese thought to be a threat to the government. You probably are most familiar with the internment camps in California, in which entire Japanese families were interned for the duration of the war. The U.S. will intern somewhere around 120,000 Japanese, of which 2/3 were U.S. citizens. But in early 1942, the first of the POWs will arrive at Camp McCoy, and the camp will stay open and operate until it closes in June of 1946. And it will have as many as 5,000 German POWs, 3,500 Japanese POWs, and 500 Korean POWs. And you might ask yourself, like I did, where did these Koreans come from? Well, we'll find out in just a minute. Initially, all Japanese POWs came to Camp McCoy. And I would assume that when they came in somewhere from the West Coast, and then they were transported to Camp McCoy. And I thought, how did they end up about in the middle of the country and about as far north as you could get? And I could not come up with an answer for why they were sent here to Camp McCoy, other than the camp was up and ready and available for them to go there. The only logical answer I could come up with, because of that battlefield conduct code that says you do nothing to help the enemy and you fight to the death, The military and the government were so concerned, and maybe even paranoid, about what might happen if any of these Japanese POWs were to escape, and what would they do to our civilian population. And therefore, they put them where they did, because they put them as far away from either the east or west coast as they could, so that they would not be able to escape. I don't know if that's the true case or not. It just seemed like a logical answer for that question. And as I mentioned, all Japanese POWs will come to Camp McCoy until they can no longer hold anymore, and then they will open a second camp in Iowa. Eventually, the Japanese POWs will be scattered in a number of camps throughout the United States, but initially they all come to Camp McCoy. I wanted to just give you a little sidelight story here of Ensign Sakamaki. Sakamaki is one of 10 Japanese naval officers selected to do a suicide mission at Pearl Harbor in 5 two-man mini-subs. 4 of those mini-subs will be sunk. 9 of those 10 officers will be killed. Sakamaki's sub, from the minute it launches from the mother sub, he has problems. His gyro compass is not working. He's 10 miles off course. He now gets back on course and he's heading towards Pearl Harbor. He's spotted by the USS Helm. It will fire its guns and set off depth charges, literally blowing Sakamaki's sub out of the water onto a coral reef. Sakamaki will attempt to sabotage his sub with explosives, and they will fail to go off. His crewmate will be carried out to sea and drown. Sakamaki is found the next morning by a military guard who is out on beach patrol, and he finds an unconscious Sakamaki laying on the beach. He will capture Sakamaki, and Sakamaki will become U.S. POW number 1. He will be sent to the U.S. When he arrives to the U.S., he will then go to Camp McCoy, and he will arrive on March 9th of 1942. And he will remain a POW for the duration of the war. Again, in the presentation another presentation I do, Victory Over Japan, you will learn much more about Sakamaki, his activities during the war, and his life following the war. Well, they found that these POWs tended to be resistant, and they tended to be territorial. That is, the Germans all stuck together in a group, as did the Japanese, as did the Koreans, and they did not get along with each other. They would actually have to have them fenced off separately from each other, even though they would use the same mess hall and showers. But even within nationalities, they did not get along. So the Nazis did not get along with the non-Nazis. The Nazis would be the party members. The non-Nazis would not be party members, but conscripted into the military to fight the war. The Nazis will intimidate, harass, and even kill the non-Nazis. While the Army and Navy, Japanese Army and Navy POWs are dedicated to the Emperor, they don't get along with each other. The Army will blame the Navy that they didn't do a sufficient job of blockading the island to prevent the Americans from attacking Japan. And there will be more Navy POWs than Army. And so the Navy will control the camp. I always kind of wondered about that. How did it end up that there were more Navy than Army? And primarily that is because of the Japanese with all their submarines and their ships and stuff that we would attack and either sink and recover these POWs, whereas we never did a land assault on Japan. And because of that battlefield code of conduct, many of the Japanese simply would never surrender. They will die first rather than surrender. But they will also find that the Japanese are suicidal because of that code of conduct, and they will have 5 Japanese suicides at Camp McCoy. Sakamaki will attempt suicide 4 times and survive. Because of that code of conduct of fighting to the death, The Japanese were never allowed to leave the camp to work. Now, that doesn't mean they didn't have work to do. It just means their work was confined to the grounds of Camp McCoy. Most of the POWs that will go out and work will be German POWs. Some Italians will also go and work, but the vast majority of them will be German POWs. But we will have escapes from Camp McCoy. There'll be 14 Japanese and 4 Germans who will escape, but they will all be caught within a relatively short time. It was somewhat useless to even attempt to escape. Even if they got out, they didn't know the language, they didn't know the land, they had no means of transportation, they had no money, and they had prison garb on with a big letter P.O.W. on the front and the back. It'd be quite obvious they were somewhere they didn't belong. Most of the POWs will simply accept their fate and wait for the end of the war and the return to their home country. One POW, German POW, said, if I'd known we were going to have these luxury conditions with beds having mattresses, pillows, and blankets, I would have surrendered a whole lot sooner, versus sleeping on the top of my tank and fighting until we had run out of ammunition. Another, when asked, if given an opportunity to escape, would you? He said, why would I do that? He said, this is heaven compared to the way we would be treated in our own home country. Another POW complained the food was so good he gained 60 pounds. If you were a POW in Germany or Japan, you probably lost 60 or more pounds. They had it good. They had food, they had shelter, they had clothing. They had opportunities to work. They had opportunities to make money. They had entertainment. Why would they want to leave? And they certainly didn't have to worry about a bomb falling on them or somebody shooting at them with a gun or a rifle. And you're going to hear some stories when we talk about the branch camps, why you'll be able to come to your own conclusion as to why many of them actually didn't want to leave the U.S. following the war. Well, here are the branch camps. They range from Antigo to Hortonville and Janesville to Wisconsin Rapids. And I'll bring the slide back up again at the end of the presentation so you can see if you may have lived, worked, or been in a near a community that had a POW camp. This is a map of where these camps were located in the state of Wisconsin. The first 15 camps will open in June of 1944. The last camp to open is Camp Ashland, which opens in August of 1945. The smallest POW camp will be Camp Bayfield with 125 POWs. The two largest POW camps will be Camp Billy Mitchell, that you know today as Mitchell International Airfield with 3,000 POWs, and Camp Door County with 2,140 POWs. The two longest continuous run camps were Camp Hartford and Camp Rockfield, which operated for 12 and 18 consecutive months. We could use the POWs for labor following the 1929 Geneva Convention and Red Cross Accords. We could not force POW officers to work, and the work could not be war-related. And if they were used for labor, they must be compensated. And they will be compensated at a rate of 80 cents a day, which was paid in the form of camp script and could only be used at that camp canteen. But in addition to this, they will receive 10 cents a day in gratuity pay. That money will be accumulated and collected, and at the end of the war, they will be given that in the form of cash to take with them when they return to their home country. Businesses that would use POW labor will pay the going hourly rate. So if they are paying their employees 40 cents an hour, we complain a minimum of 20 is just way too little. Imagine working for 40 cents an hour. But let's say they were working 12 hours. That would be a total of $4.80 for the day. The POW would get to keep 80 cents in the form of camp script. The military would get $4. Based on this POW labor, the U.S. will earn somewhere around $360 million. more than paying for the cost of these POW camps and helping to offset the cost of the war. What type of work would they do? They do harvesting of crops. I'm not a big vegetable eater, and I didn't realize we grew all these vegetables in Wisconsin, but we do. Interestingly enough, in 1930, Wisconsin had 171 canneries individually owned. So Stokely owned this one, Green Giant owned that one. And then in the early 1940s, they started buying them up. So one company may have multiple canneries throughout the state. But they will also work at orchards, lumbering, dairies, farming, canneries, industrial factories, tanneries. Pretty much anywhere where there may have been a labor shortage, you may have found POWs working. And where would they stay? They would stay at fairgrounds and buildings, tent encampments, farms, cannery property, military bases, and government buildings. Here is Camp Bayfield, which was the Bayfield County Courthouse and community building. I've actually gone to court in this courthouse, it's still there today. The POWs will sleep on the gym floor in the upper level. They will take their showers in the basement. Their kitchen and mess hall will be on the first floor. Security here will consist of 2 guard stations out front and a picket fence across the back of the building to keep civilians out. In the upper left is Camp Reedsburg, a tent encampment, and down below is Camp Plymouth at the fairgrounds. The POWs will stay in this large building, and the tent will serve as their kitchen and their mess hall. Now, Camp McCoy will have the most secure facility. And again, remember, that's because we have our Japanese POWs there. Many of these branch camps, some will have security. They'll have fencing. They may even have guard towers. Some of them won't have any security whatsoever, like Camp Reedsburg, until the local editor writes an editorial complaining about the lack of security. So the camp commander made sure he'd make this camp secure, and he marked the boundaries of this camp with a picket fence. Now, the purpose of that picket fence was not to prevent the POWs from escaping. The purpose of the picket fence was to keep the civilians out of the camp. Regardless of what type of or level of security they may have had, they will all have military guards. Here's Camp Rockfield. This is the one that ran the longest for 18 consecutive months. And what you see here, this is actually a guard station, not a guard tower. And this was a tent encampment, and they even had a banner over their camp announcing this camp location. Here's Camp Hartford, which was located in Hartford, Wisconsin. And this camp was located at the Swartz Ballroom. And this is where the big bands like Lawrence Welk and Benny Goodman and others would come and perform. It was considered to be a luxury dance hall. It was 120 feet across, had a towering ceiling that had a 16-foot, 2-ton chandelier hanging from the roof. This camp will be open year-round because in addition to seasonal work, they will have other work that could be performed continuously, such as dairy farms, milk and cheese processing plants, and other manufacturing. They will grow hemp here, as will many of the branch camps around Wisconsin. Wisconsin will be one of the largest hemp growers in the state in the U.S. during World War II. And that hemp still grows wild in Wisconsin now. I could tell you another whole story about that, but we'll save it for another presentation that I do. An interesting story here. There was a farmer that would come to the camp and pick up the waste food and take it back to feed to his pigs. He would go to the camp commander and complain about the amount of food being wasted. The camp commander decides he's going to take care of that problem, that farmer, and he goes out and he buys 10 little piglets and brings them back to the camp to feed the waste food to them. And when they get big, he will feed them to the POWs. In 1945, this camp will make $250,182 for the government from P.O.W. labor. And following the war, the big bands will never come back to the Swartz Ballroom. Well, let me run through a bunch of stories here for you and give you some idea of what life was like at these branch camps. I'll begin with Camp Antigo. Many of the POWs will go and work at farms, and when they would have a lunch break, the farm family would offer them corn to eat, and they would refuse to eat that corn because they said it was swine food. And that would happen at a number of locations. However, at one location, they will butter and salt that corn. The German POWs will eat it, they like it, and they request to have some of that dried corn seed to take with them when they return home. Obviously, they didn't know anything about sweet corn. Now, I could relate to this story in that my father-in-law was of German descent, grew up on a farm here in Wisconsin, and whenever we would have corn, he would refuse to eat it because he said that is what we would use to fatten the pigs. So obviously that was something in his hereditary from Germany that came all the way to the U.S. with their descendants. I will come back to Camp Billy Mitchell. I'm going to jump to Camp Cobb. There's a German POW barber, and he would provide free haircuts to the POWs and the guards until the local barber goes to the camp commander and complains he's losing business and money. Thereon after, the guards could no longer get free haircuts, but the barber didn't make any money. The guards were so upset about the fact they couldn't get free haircuts, they will go to the next town to get their hair cut. There's also a 14-year-old here working in a hemp field. He's approached by a POW, and the POW says, "Why aren't you in the military fighting the war?" And he says, "Well, I'm only 14. And the POW says, "Well, I'm 16. From the research that I did here in this book, it would appear that the German POWs will range in age from 14 to 65. Germany at that point was probably using every male available to fight the war. Camp Fond du Lac. They arrive by train and they go to the camp, which is at the fairgrounds. 2 weeks after they arrive, the local beer distributor will drop off 25 cases of beer. Well, the military like their beer, but so do the Germans. And he would show up every other day after that with more beer deliveries. They had an escape here. They make the announcement in the community, and the people begin to panic. They're concerned because we have an escaped POW. They begin to search for this POW. They will find him 2 hours later sitting in a local bar having a drink. It was reported here, and this is the only one that it reported this. I don't doubt that this happened in many places throughout the United States, that an American woman becomes pregnant via a POW. Somebody asked me, it was kind of an interesting question when I was doing this at another location. Did the women marry the POWs? No, they were not allowed to do that. If they were going to do that, they would have to come back to the U.S. and then get married. However, at one location, the POWs were allowed to do proxy marriages at the camp. So in other words, if they had the fiancée girlfriend back in Germany, they could have an American woman or some woman come in as a proxy and they would get married, and that would be considered a legal marriage between the POW and the woman back in Germany. However, at many camps, and there's one camp in which, I want to say it's Hortonville, something like 5 or 6 of the guards would end up marrying local women that were in that area where the camp was. Camp Fox Lake. Here the POWs are pranking the guards. They would get matches to light their cigarettes and their pipes. They will begin to collect these match heads and put them into a metal box, and they will collect enough to totally stuff that box. Then one night they will sneak out, they'll put this box on a small hill, light it with a fuse, and stand outside their tents. The box will explode with a loud bang. The guards will panic and grab their rifles and start shooting. And the POWs will stand there laughing hilariously. And they are given punishment, and they will receive half rations for a week. But that doesn't stop the POWs. They're now out on a work crew cutting down trees. In the process of cutting up the branches of those trees, they realized the tree fell on a large skunk and killed the skunk. They will dig a hole and bury the skunk. They will put a cross on that hole, and they will stand around with their heads bowed. The guards see this and they panic, thinking they've buried a POW. They rush and grab their shovels and go and start digging and find the skunk. Again, the POWs are laughing hilariously. And again, they are punished with half rations for a week. But the guards get their revenge. The Germans like to grow their hair long, and they like to comb and groom their hair. And they didn't have the hair creams at the camps like they would back in their home country. One of the POWs said, well, you know, those hair creams back home have birch sap. And so they find a birch tree and they get some of the sap and they put it in their hair, and it worked really well for combing and grooming until it dried. And then it'll look like a helmet on their head. So the guards will get their revenge and they will shave all of their heads. Camp Fredonia. This is a new culture for these German POWs. The language is different. The land is different. The weather may or not be different. The farming environment is different. And so one of the new things they will do is taste foods they've never tasted before, like Jell-O, which they come to like. Another one will be German potato salad. Now, I assume they had potato salad in Germany. They just didn't call it German. And one of their favorite desserts will be apple pie, which I, again, assumed was universal. But apparently they didn't have that in Germany at that time. Camp Galesville. Interesting story. Staff Sergeant Cram. He's one of 18 of 287 in his unit to survive the Battle of the Bouch. He's captured, and he's a German POW. He will go all the way down to 60 pounds, and he manages to escape. He's recovered by the Allied forces, and he's sent back to the U.S. for his recovery. And he goes to a military medical facility in Chicago. He's given a leave of absence from the hospital, and he goes to his hometown of Galesville. He spends the first couple of nights at home in his recovery, and then he decides to go out to one of his old favorite hangouts called the Coffee Cup. He enters the Coffee Cup, and he's astonished to see German POWs having a drink and a good time, and the guards joining them with their rifles leaning against the wall. He's furious. He rushes home, grabs his Winchester, goes back to the Coffee Cup, orders all of the civilians out, lines up the POWs and the guards, and marches them all back to camp. The camp commander gets things settled. Staff Sergeant Cram goes back to Chicago, but thereon after, no POWs will be allowed in downtown Galesville. Camp Green Lake. Perhaps maybe one of the most interesting stories of the branch camp. This camp was located on the Lawson Farm. You may know it today as the Lawsonia Golf Course, one of the top golf courses in the Midwest. I have a brother-in-law that lives in Princeton, and he said, oh, that's what those stone towers are. Yes, they built their guard towers out of stone and rock, and they still stand on the grounds today. In this story, there was a German immigrant family in Milwaukee. They owned the Deutschland Dairy. The mother decides to take her 16-year-old son and baby daughter back to Germany to visit with the grandparents. When they get to Germany, the Germans will confiscate the 16-year-old's passport, and they will draft him into the military. He will become a paratrooper. He will jump into the war over Cyprus, and shortly thereafter he will surrender to the Allied forces. He will be sent back to the U.S., and he will arrive at Camp Green Lake. He tries to convince them that he is a U.S. citizen. They tend to believe that he is, but they will treat him as a POW, using him as an interpreter for the POWs and the guards. At the end of the war, they do not release him. They repatriate him back to Germany. Now he needs to apply again for a visa, which he does, and eventually is granted and comes back to the U.S. That story happened here at Green Lake from some of the research I did that appeared to have happened at more than one location throughout the United States. Camp Hortonville. In Bear Creek, there is a sauerkraut factory. That factory is still there today. Just recently, the holding company announced they're making a $12 million addition to this plant and establishing their corporate headquarters here in Madison, Wisconsin. Here there is a 17-year-old who would fill in for his father, drive in a school bus. He'd go and pick up the POWs, take them to the factory, and then at the end of the day, pick them up and bring them back. And when he'd pick them up, all of the POWs get on the bus, followed by a single military guard. When the guard got on the bus, he'd take his rifle and he'd throw it to one of the POWs and go sit up front and talk to the 17-year-old driver. He was a little concerned about those POWs holding onto that rifle until he finally figured out that rifle never had any ammunition in it. In another location, they had picked up a crew of POWs. They were heading back to the camp. They get several miles down the road and realize they're missing one of the POWs. They turn the bus around to go back and see if they can find him, and here he is running down the road trying to catch up to the bus. Obviously, he didn't want to have to walk all the way back to camp, and he was probably concerned about missing his supper. Now, these two short little stories kind of tell you that if these POWs wanted to escape, they had plenty of opportunities to do so. Remember, they would go to these large farms, generally with just a small number of guards, in some cases no guards at all. And again, they had opportunities to escape. Camp Janesville. This is located on the southwest corner of Janesville. It was a 10-acre site. Had a double barbed wire fence around the camp. It even had a guard tower on each end of the camp. There was a truck taking 17 POWs to a work site. It was involved in a traffic accident. The truck rolls over. 7 of the POWs are hospitalized. No Americans were injured, and the only American involved was the driver, the guard that drove the truck. Another really interesting story here. Many of the POWs will go and work at the farms. In 1944 and 1945, we had what we call the perfect storm. The majority of our men were in the military, either in the military or overseas fighting the war. So there was a severe shortage of labor. And also during those years, we'll have boom crops of peas and beans and other vegetables. And again, we have no labor to help. We needed the POWs in order to save these crops. And they did with their labor. So if a large number of the POWs were going to a farm, the military would truck them out to the farm. They would stay there and act as guards. They might even work with the POWs just to give them something to do. But if the farmer only needed a few POWs, he'd actually go to the camp, pick them up himself, take them to the farm, and then return them at the end of the day. The story here is that there was a farmer who only needed 3 POWs to finish his work or to do work in the morning. So he picks them up, takes them to the farm. They complete their work in the morning. He needs to get them down the road to a neighbor's farm to finish up the afternoon. And he will have his daughter drive them from their farm to the other farm. Now, kids back in the 1940s got involved in that farm business at a very early age. His daughter that transported these POWs actually went past a state patrol car on her way, and she was 9 years old. Again, this story gives you the example that if they wanted to attack and assault U.S. citizens, they certainly had opportunities to do so. My research, I don't doubt it could have happened, but in my research, I did not find any cases where civilians were either attacked or assaulted by POWs. Camp Jefferson. There was a banker who had a stately home on a farm, and he also had a maid, and he had a dachshund by the name of Shotzi. And periodically, Shotzi would escape the house and go out where those POWs were working. the maid would go to the back door and yell, "Shotzi, Shotzi." And the POWs would immediately begin hooting and hollering at her, and she didn't know why. And perhaps somebody should have told her that in German, Schatzi means sweetheart. Camp Lake Kisas. This is the most posh of the POW camps. It was located at the Candler Resort, a luxury resort. It had its own dock and its own beach with men and women's changing room with showers. It had a kitchen and a restaurant, and it had a dance hall. And the POWs will stay in this dance hall in bunks stacked 4 high, and they'll do a fair amount of damage to that dance floor. Here, the military goes into town with their speakers, take shelter, we've had POWs escape. They have 2 POWs missing. Again, the community panics because now we have these POWs on the loose. They will begin searching for them, and they will find these 2 POWs 2 hours later walking down a county road with 2 of the local girls. It also was reported that the resort owner's wife would raise chickens, and the POWs would steal and eat these chickens. And perhaps because of that and the damage done to his dance floor, he will not renew his contract with the government the next year. Camp Markesan. This is kind of interesting because in 1944, they did not have a camp. Their camp will be in 1945. And they will get their POW workers from Camp Green Lake. And it will be reversed in 1945. The camp will be in Markesan. Green Lake will get the POWs from Markesan. But it was reported in 1944 that there was a Nazi that killed another POW and stabbed a guard. It is never confirmed, because these stories are censored and the papers agreed to censor the stories. The military considers such a thing to be an internal affair and they will deal with it, and they did. But the way we confirm this story is the employees working in the canneries in that year, 1944, say that they have a bad batch of German POWs. And by that they mean they have these German POWs that either refuse to work or don't put out much effort or even attempt to sabotage the machinery. These are the Nazi POWs. If they determine it is a Nazi POW, they will then take that POW and they will immediately be sent back to one of 2 base camps that at that time Wisconsin was using to get their POW workers, either Camp McCoy or Camp Sheridan, just north of Chicago. And then they would never be allowed to leave the base camp to go and work again. And the way we, again, confirming this story, they mentioned in 1944 they have this bad batch of German POWs, and in 1945 now at the canneries they say, we got a great batch of German POWs. They're more than willing to work. They're willing to put in the long hours just like the people who worked in the cannery. At this camp, remember Sakamaki's mini sub that we talked about earlier? It will be brought to the U.S. It will travel the U.S. through 41 states and 2,200 cities in an effort to raise war bonds. They will cut 7 holes, portholes in the side of the sub, and for $1 you could look inside that sub to see what it looked like in a Japanese submarine. And it will come and travel through Markesan. In May, and I never remember the date, 7th or 8th of 1945, everything changes at these camps. That is the day that Germany surrenders unconditionally. I always wondered what's the difference between surrendering conditionally and unconditionally. And that was the big hang-up we had with the U.S. and Japan, because Japan refused to surrender unconditionally. And the U.S. said the only way we're going to accept a surrender is unconditionally. The difference is if they surrender with conditions, that means they will give up everything other than their government, which they will retain. If they surrender unconditionally, they give up everything, including their government and form of government. Well, once we have this surrender by Germany, as I mentioned, everything changes. The POWs wouldn't even think about escaping at this point. They know they're going to be going home soon. Civilians aren't concerned about these POWs in our backyard now because Why would they even attempt to escape? They're going home soon. So everything changes. The guards become much more relaxed. In Camp Hortonville, when they first put the camp and they have their fence around the camp, they will station a guard every 5 feet. A month or so later, there'll maybe be one maybe every 10 or 12 feet. By the end of third month or so, they only have a guard at every corner of the camp. They realize that these POWs aren't going to escape. There's no reason for them to do so. They've got it too good at the camp. And many of them will be given the title of trustee, and they will be allowed to leave the camp and walk into the town, go to the bars, go to the movies, go to restaurants. Many people that from the Milwaukee area, I believe it's Howell Avenue that runs right along the airport, will complain that they see Germans in all the bars on Howell Avenue. Camp Sheboygan. When looking for a site, they decided to use the abandoned Sheboygan County Asylum, which was considered to be haunted then and now. But it was a nice facility in terms of its size. It had showers, it had kitchens, worked out quite well. They say the biggest problem they had, as they did at many of these camps, was keeping the teenage girls out of the camp. The women were very impressed with these German soldiers that came from Africa, Rommel's Corps. They were young, they were abrasive, they were tanned, and they wore shorts. And this will be the first time in the U.S. that they will see men wearing shorts. But here, one interesting story. There was a 13-year-old, and he's at home, and he looks out the window, and he sees two strange men coming up the driveway with these long coats. Has no idea who they are. There's a knock on the door. The dad answers the door, and it turns out it's two POWs, and one of them is his dad's brother. His parents had immigrated to the U.S. His brother was still in Germany fighting the war. They have a conversation. It's in German. The 13-year-old doesn't understand it. A while later, he looks out the window and he sees a camp guard and two MPs coming up the driveway. The father tells the mother to put the two POWs in the basement. There's a knock on the door. Dad answers the door. The guard said, "Have you seen a couple of POWs?" And Dad goes, "No, I haven't seen any POWs." The guard's quite astonished because he then says, "Well, they were given permission to come and see you." And he now realizes his mistake, and they bring up the POWs and send them back to the camp. Camp Sturgeon Bay. This consisted of 7 sites, the largest being at the Sturgeon Bay Fairground. The other 6 sites are scattered at orchards throughout the county. The POWs will either stay in tents or barracks, which normally would have been occupied by immigrants that we would have brought into the U.S. to assist in the picking. It is said that the German POW saved the 1945 Door County cherry crop. The combination of these 7 sites will pick 508,020 pails of cherries, earning the government a total of $101,604. Campbell Pond. We have a prison in Campbell Pond, but we also now have a POW camp. And I call this the most scandalous of the stories. Perhaps getting pregnant might be pretty scandalous as well. But in this one, there is a German POW who acts as an interpreter, and he is exchanging notes with an American woman who lives in a house adjacent to the POW camp. This exchange of notes escalates into nightly visits. The neighbors think it's maybe one of the guards coming to visit, but they report it to the police. The police investigate and realize that this is a POW. He is immediately sent back to the base camp, Camp Sheridan, and he's given the most severe penalty they could give a POW at that time, 14 months of bread and water, followed by 16 months of hard labor. The American women will plead guilty to adultery and be sentenced to 1 year of probation. Obviously, times have changed quite a bit since that time. Well, there are many more camp stories that could be told, But, I want to finish up here with Camp Billy Mitchell. Camp Billy Mitchell was the largest of the branch camp with 3,000 POWs. The POWs will operate the longest battery assembly line at that time for an affiliate of Railback Batteries, making small batteries for radio and transmitters. They will print and publish their own newspaper in their own language. They will hold a public exhibition for drawings and artwork done by the POWs. An interesting story here. They had just received a new batch of German POWs, and that night, 2 of those POWs will sneak along the fence and go over and escape. And they will head into Milwaukee, and they come across a dance hall, and they figured that's a good place to go in and get a beer. They're surprised that a number of the people in the dance hall speak German, but even more surprised that most of them speak Polish. And I think maybe they had escaped in Poland rather than the U.S. And at that time, the Milwaukee police are looking for 2 individuals that had committed mail fraud. And these 2 look suspicious. Their head is shaved and they have their clothes on inside out. And so they take them into custody and they interview them and realize these are not the individuals they're looking for, that they are escaped POWs. They take them back to the POW camp. The camp didn't even know they had escaped. But because of that, they will now be required to put a second fence around the camp. They will now put guard towers in each corner. You can see them here, guard towers at each of these stations here in the corners. And they will have searchlights, and those searchlights will stay on all night long. When the police leave, the 2 POWs thank the police for not shooting them, because the expectation was that if you attempted to escape, you would be shot and killed. If you managed to escape a POW camp in Germany, you would not be shot on sight. You would be taken back to the camp. All of the POWs or prisoners would be lined up to watch the execution, so you would know what would happen to you if you attempted to escape. Remember I said the stories about POWs and POW camps were censored. There would be times when the news media would be allowed in to see what these camps looked like and what the conditions were like. Camp Columbus was one of those examples. And so we have a fair number of photos from Camp Columbus. Here they're working in a vinery, marching to be loaded on their truck in front of their barracks, cleaning their clothes on the concrete floor. Here's Camp Door County. Again, we have a fair number of photos here. Arriving by train, doing their own cooking, working in the fields, both the guards and the POWs. And here's a good example of that P.W. on the front and back of their clothing. Here's Camp Green Lake. They're getting off the train and loading onto the truck. Here's Camp Waupun. Camp Appleton, they're actually in front of a cannery. Camp Hortonville, diagram. Camp Lodi, just outside of Madison here. Here's Camp Fond du Lac. Again, you can see the good example of very tight security at these camps. All right? Again, remember, the primary purpose was to keep the civilians out of the camp. Nobody was worried about the POWs actually escaping. This is an interesting story. John Pruss here was a guard at a POW camp. And he asked one of the German POWs to carve a boat for his son. And this is the boat that he carved. And this is his son, Terry Pruss, now 85 years old, and a resident of Denver, Colorado. And he thought this boat really belongs in the Plymouth Historical Society Museum. So he contacts the president of the museum to tell him what he has. It turns out the president at that time happened to be in Denver, Colorado. He said, I'll be glad to come and pick that up and take it back with me so you do not have to deliver it. And today it is in the Plymouth Museum. Well, I want to kind of just wrap up here and talk about the largest German Stalag, or German POW camp. This camp ran continuously for 6 years. It had Allied POWs. It was the only Stalag to never have an escape. You may have seen this Stalag on TV. and it was known as Stalag 13. You probably know it as Hogan's Heroes. The main characters are Colonel Klink, Sergeant Schultz, American Colonel Hogan, Frenchman Corporal LeBeau, American Sergeant Kinchlow and Sergeant Carter, and British Corporal Newkirk. The show ran from 1965 to 1971, filming 168 episodes. Only Colonel Klink and Colonel Hogan appear in all 168 episodes. The four German officers, or the men that played the part of the four German officers, Klink, Schultz, General Burkhalter, and Major Hochstetter, were all Jewish. Klink, Schultz, Burkhalter all escaped Nazi Germany. Frenchman Corporal LeBeau survived a concentration camp. If you watch the show on a regular basis, you would often see this six-wheeled vehicle, off-road vehicle, with General Burkhalter either entering or exiting the camp. This is a 1938 Mercedes-Benz. There were only, you would often find Hitler standing in such a vehicle during military parades. There were only ever 57 of these vehicles made from 1931 to 1939. And only 3 will survive the war. This one ends up in Hogan's Heroes. Hogan's Heroes is still on TV. I happened to, maybe a month ago, caught 2 episodes, and in both of those, Colonel Burkhalter either arrives or departs in this vehicle. Well, we've now answered 4 of those 5 questions that I started with at the beginning of the presentation. We only have left the last question. What happened to the POWs after the war? You can see, based on the stories that we told, they had it pretty good. YMCAs would go to some of the camps and provide them with instruments, and they would form their own band or orchestra. Or they may form their own choir, and they will perform for the POWs and the guards and the community. The community may go and stand outside the fence and watch these Germans playing this odd game they've never seen before called soccer. Things were good. They didn't want to leave. Many of them wanted to stay. But none of the POWs were allowed to stay. They will all be repatriated, the last leaving in June of 1946. They could come back via a visa. But in order to get the visa, they would have to have a sponsor, and the sponsor would have to guarantee that they would have a place to live and a job to work. I want to finish up here telling you one story of a POW who did just that. And this is the story of Kurt Peckman from Germany. He was captured on November 6th of 1943. He will arrive at Camp Ellis in Illinois, and he will then eventually come to Wisconsin. You can see him here at Camp Hartford. Here you can see him as a soccer player on the camp team. He will go to many different locations, branch camps in Wisconsin. At the end of the war, he is repatriated. When they are repatriated, the POWs do not go directly back to their home country. They will either be sent to France or to Britain, and they are obligated to perform 2 years of service. Kurt Peckman will go to France to do his 2 years of service, saying that that service in France was more difficult than it was here in the U.S. Following that 2 years of service, he will go to his home country. There's nothing there. It's been destroyed in the war. He will contact a farmer he got to know in Lodi and ask if the farmer will sponsor him to come back to the U.S., and the farmer agrees to do so. So Kurt Peckman will come with his wife to Wisconsin and go to Lodi. He will work for that farmer for 9 months to pay his obligation for coming back. After that, he will then head into Madison, and he will become an engraver. Here you can see him back in Germany as an engraver. And he will get a job with the Madison Monument Company. Now, I didn't know anything about this story. There's a gentleman in Stoughton who, after the presentation, asked if I knew about Kurt Peckman, and I said no. And he said, well, I will send you the story, and he did. And he said the Madison Monument Company was my dad's company. After working there for many years, Kurt Peckman will buy that company, and it will become the Peckman Memorial Company, which is still operating today, operated by his son and his grandson. Now, what's really neat about this story is this. Because of the treatment that he received here in the U.S. as a POW, he would dedicate his life and his business to honor U.S. veterans and law enforcement. And the Peckman Company will put up many veteran monuments throughout the state of Wisconsin. If you want to see what I think is probably the most beautiful veterans monument in the state of Wisconsin, go to Stoughton. They have a gorgeous veterans monument consisting of 6-foot-high solid black granite and many other granite stones, unique stones. They will have statuettes of pictures telling about from the Civil or honoring from the Civil War all the way up to the most recent military affair. They will list all 2,000 or so U.S. Wisconsin military that were killed during war, from the Civil War all the way up to our most recent battle. Another interesting story that came to me after another presentation. A woman came up to me and said she wanted to share her story that her community was going to build a small veterans monument. And she said, we knew that we needed to do a fundraiser, but we didn't know what else we'd need to do. She said, I just randomly picked a memorial company in Madison to get information, and I picked Peckman Memorial. The individual answered the phone. She said, I said to him, this is a cold call. We want to build a veterans memorial, and we know we need to do a fundraiser. And she said at that point, he cut her off and said, what do you need? When do you need it? And it's free. Again, based on Kurt Peckman's treatment as a POW. Now, I did this presentation a week or so ago at Madison College, and I told this story, and I didn't know ahead of time. Maybe it's a good thing I didn't know ahead of time. When I got done with the presentation, I was actually approached, and he introduced himself, the son of Gary Peckman. I'm sorry, the son of Kurt Peckman, Gary Peckman. He's here today, sitting right here in front. Gary has shared with me that he said his father, when he was alive, would say November 6, 1943 was the day he was captured and became eventually a POW. And he would say throughout his life, that was the best day of his life, because that led to him being here as a POW, and it then led to him being able to come back and establish a business here in Madison and honor veterans and law enforcement through their services. I thought it was a really cool story to be able to share with all of you to finish up this presentation. Well, if you want to know more about POW camps in Wisconsin, I would suggest you get the book, Stalag, Wisconsin. There's more stories to be told, and they are quite interesting. And I'm going to then finish up here by leaving this up here. Again, these are the 38 branch camps that we had in Wisconsin. You can check and see if you may have lived, worked, or grew up in a community that had a POW camp. And with that, I will thank you for your time and your attention. If you have questions, I'd be glad to try and answer those for you.
I was just going to thank Bob so much for the scope and depth of your presentation, and then that wonderful story that honors our veterans and our POWs and their sacrifices that they have made. It's beautifully done. Thank you, Bob. So as Bob said, he's available for questions. What we might do is just invite you to help yourself to, we have treats over here on the side table. You're welcome to and visit with Bob. Also, we want to invite you to join the Fitchburg Historical Society. We always appreciate new members, and from the board, Roger Tesh is in the back at the table, and he would be glad to talk to you about membership in the Fitchburg Historical Society. So, again, thank you so much for being here this afternoon for this wonderful presentation by Bob. Thank you.
Does anybody have a quick question that I could try? Hold. If you do, I'm going to bring you the mic so people can hear the question.
I never heard the explanation of the Korean prisoners of war.
Oh, I'm sorry. I guess I forgot to put that in. The question was, how did the Koreans get there? Remember, World War II went from September 1939 to 1941. China and Japan have already started the war back in 1937. Japan is trying to expand their empire. And now remember, in order to fight a war, you need oil, you need steel. They don't have it in Japan. So they're going to the South Pacific nations and attacking. And they have taken and conquered large portions of China, and including other Asian countries such as Korea. So they have conquered Korea, and they have now forced the Koreans to fight the war for Japan.
Well, actually, this might be an explanation why Germans did not want to eat the corn here. For two reasons. Yeah, first of all, because the corn was given to the swine, but also because in Italy and Austrian Germany, and I believe probably the rest of Europe, I'm Italian, was born and raised in Italy, we did not have sweet corn. So when they saw the corn, they thought it was the hard kernel, the one that you can't really eat. And I only ate corn when I was 19 years old because my husband was in the NATO in Italy, and so they had a feast and they had corn, and I did not want to eat it. And I thought there's no way in the world that I ate something like that, like the animals. And my dad and my mom with me said, no, we're not going to eat it. And so he just pursued me to eat, and I said, what happened here? This is soft and sweet. And so then I convinced my dad. My dad was in a concentration camp in Germany for 2 years. And at the end of the war, he went through one of those marches because the Germans were taking everybody to the West. They did not want to be caught by the Russian. It was better to be caught by the Ally.
Yeah, one other question that I will often get asked, were the POWs brought to Wisconsin because we had such a large German population? And the answer is no. They were brought to Wisconsin because we had work for them to do. Yes, the fact we had Germans. Remember, the government did not want the civilians talking with the POWs. Obviously, if they're at the farm, many farmers still spoke German. They're going to carry on a conversation. So in Germany, if you're a resident and you talk to a POW, you were going to end up in a concentration camp. So they were treated quite a bit different.
I get what you're saying about how the POWs were not, weren't a lot of arrests or assaults or whatever. But was there ever the civilians that assaulted the POWs because they were upset about war, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, you all heard the question, did any civilians attack POWs? I didn't find any such stories. However, that was one of the concerns and why the stories were censored and they didn't tell the U.S. citizens. Because once our U.S. citizens found out how our POWs were being treated, they were not very happy about these POWs and the treatment they were receiving, and the military would be concerned about the civilians coming and approaching and maybe harming the POWs. That did happen, and again, I can't remember which camp it was. It turned out that the vice camp commander, whatever their title was actually a German native, and the citizens were complaining that he was being way too lenient with the POWs. And there were a number of Germans in that area that were going because the Germans were notorious for singing songs. And when they were singing their songs, the German residents wanted to get into the camp in order to sing with them. And again, they had all kinds of problems with that. So yeah, there may have been some of that going on. I just didn't see any real stories about it.
My brother and I live in Jefferson, so I had heard the story before about the maid and what she would call to after the dog. But I'm wondering, I've been starting to watch some stories on YouTube about prisoners and how they were treated medically and how so many of them were surprised at the foods they were being offered, the quantity. Are those episodes that are on YouTube pretty much accurate as to what?
Yeah, I don't know because I haven't watched them. I would guess that many of them are pretty accurate historically. Yeah, I'm just doing a research on a new project talking about that. They did get dental care. They did get medical care. Under the Geneva Convention, they were required, the camps were required to have religious services. And it was not unusual. They either bring a minister or a priest into the camp, or in many cases, they would go to the local church. They'd hold a service for the community, and then following that, they would leave and they'd bring in the POWs and hold a separate service. So, yeah, there's all kinds of interesting stories like that.
Russian POWs? Huh? Russian POWs? Why were there Russian POWs?
Initially, Russia and Germany signed I forgot what the term is, signed an agreement that they would not fight against each other. And eventually, Russia quickly learned that Germany was not going to be a friend, and Germany realized very quickly that Russia was not going to be a friend, and that disintegrated quite quickly. But you may have one of two things. Either somebody was fighting with Germany and they were captured, or they were captured and they didn't really know, is this a German or who is this? We captured them. So they ended up here, just like the German 16-year-old that ends up coming back and then they treat him as a POW. Anything else? All right. Well, like I said, I'll stick around. And if you have more, feel free to come up and I'll try to answer those for you. Thanks again. Have a good day.
I'm wondering about the camps.